Hello, I'm Colin Sanders and this is the History Books Review. I'm continuing my extended review of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. In this episode, Gaul falls to the Germans. While the invasion by Alaric threw Italy into crisis, Germany was in turmoil. There was increasing pressure from the Huns in the east. Gibbon traces its origin all the way back to China, which is probably fanciful, but I suppose isn't impossible. From this emerged a new barbarian leader who rapidly became an enemy of Rome. Alaric was a Christian who understood the empire intimately. In contrast, the new leader was an out-and-out barbarian. His name was Radagaisus, and he was not just a pagan, but a sincere one who regularly sacrificed to his gods. He treated the civilized world with contempt rather than envy. It was widely believed that he had taken a vow to reduce the city of Rome to rubble and to sacrifice the senators to his heavenly supporters. He probably led about 20,000 warriors from a mixture of tribes. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of military finesse about his approach. He crossed the undefended border, then marched across the equally undefended River Po and laid siege to Florence. This would have been pretty much motivated by the desire for booty rather than any grand plan. The inhabitants of the besieged city were fighting for their lives, and there was no avenue open for negotiation. Stilicho raised, with some difficulty, some 40,000 troops. He tempted back deserters. He offered freedom and 2 pieces of gold to slaves who would join him. What the slave owners thought about this isn't recorded. He again pulled all the northern provincial forces he could summon back to deal with the crisis in Italy. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Florence were reduced to their last strength. They kept going with encouragement from St. Ambrose. He was, of course, still dead, but he sent hopeful messages in dreams. Ambrose may not have been alive, but he was luckily well informed. One day the defenders looked out to see the banners of Stilicho in the distance. It was now the barbarians' turn to be besieged as Stilicho surrounded their camp. In the end they surrendered. Radagaisus was held for a while and then executed. 10,000 of his followers were recruited into the Roman army, and the rest of the captives were sold into slavery. The numbers involved were so great that the sudden sale collapsed the market for slaves, and most of them went for really good prices. Not every purchaser got a bargain, though. A lot of them were malnourished and died shortly afterwards, and those that ended up in Rome itself may well have been something their owners would have been better off without, as we shall see a bit later. So, dangerous as it was, the invasion of Italy by Radagaisus did have some beneficial effects. It cemented the reputation of Stilicho as the saviour of Italy. He emerged from the conflict stronger and now with a reasonable-sized army under his control. He had also developed further the technique he had already been using against Alaric of building walls, ditches and fortifications to hamper the movement of the barbarians and to trap them where they could be dealt with. This wasn't by any means a new technique. Caesar had used it to good effect and described it in detail in his campaign journals. It's an obvious enough solution to fighting highly mobile forces that are hard to make contact with. The British would be using the same tactics against the Boers in the late 19th century. It was a strategy particularly well suited to the situation in Italy in the 5th century, where the empire still had plenty of muscle power but was short of trained fighting men. Stilicho's priority was preserving the army, which was the last one the empire had. He was getting good at doing exactly that, but for all his virtues he could not save Gaul. The winter of 406-407 marked the end of Roman rule in Gaul in any meaningful sense. The survivors of the army of Radagaisus moved up to Gaul, and large numbers of other German tribesmen crossed the frozen River Rhine to pour into the undefended provinces. Cities were destroyed, citizens were enslaved, order broke down. These were folk movements rather than military invasions. The locals were not necessarily butchered. They might be enslaved or even just chased away. A poet even records being paid for his farm by its new occupier, albeit a derisive sum. Some people will pay for a clean conscience. The invaders were looking for somewhere to live rather than spoil and plunder. It is quite likely that it was the speed of the breakdown of the imperial system that gave the Germans a unique opportunity. With more warning, the Gauls could have organised a resistance and would quite likely have succeeded. The depletion of the frontier troops was a temporary expedient to respond to a particular crisis, and there would have been every expectation that they would soon be back. But as it was, the map of the Roman world had been changed forever. The southern provinces of Gaul were now occupied by large numbers of German warriors who would not give up what they had taken lightly. The Roman presence in Germany, which depended on the support of the frontier, was also swept away. The decline of the power of the empire was now visible to anyone who chose to observe it. One point I should make actually is that in given fact there's no evidence from the sources that the Rhine was frozen when the barbarians crossed it. Gibbon I think was just being fanciful there. He covers himself by the use of the word probably, but it's such a powerful image that later writers have recycled it. Many have done just as I've done and simply quoted it as a fact. It doesn't seem to me at all unreasonable to imagine that's exactly what happened. After all, there isn't much else to be said for December as a month to travel in unless you want to take advantage of the frozen water. I tried to find out what the climate was like in that part of Europe in the 5th century. To my surprise, it turns out that we don't really have any good idea of it, but maybe I was on the wrong track anyway, because it wasn't really a climatic event. It was basically down to the fact the troops weren't there when they should have been. In the next episode, we'll be looking at what went on in Britain, and I hope you can join me for that. In the meantime, thanks for listening.